This evening's broadcast is brought to you by Home Guys Home Services. Hello, and thank you for joining this broadcast of Port Angeles News. I'm your host, Arthur Wojnowski. For the remainder of our time, we will be playing our interview with City Council member Mike French.
One of the other kind of nerdy things that I love is game design. There's this man who was a game designer, and he had this podcast that I listened to for a long time, and he talked about iterative design, where you make a game or whatever it is, and then you try it, and then you make changes, you try it, and you make changes, you try it, and you keep on going through an iteration over and over again. And that's kind of my part of the way I process is I come to an opinion, and I'll back that opinion up, and I'll be firm on that opinion, but my goal is not to just hammer away at that opinion. My goal is to improve it and to keep iterating and to say, okay, that's one way of looking at it. Let's, keep going and pushing so that we can solidify it. And this kind of all comes back to, the Socratic method. That's an iterative form of argument where you have a claim and then you question that claim, and you keep when it survives questioning, you gain strength in your confidence of the truth of that claim. And when it doesn't survive questioning, you lose confidence in the strength of that claim. And so, but I do quickly come to opinions. But then I want to just really, I want to be able to back it up. And that's something that I decided a long time ago, that I didn't want to believe things that I couldn't explain. And so, if I can't explain it, so I love, having kids is great for that, because you have to explain everything. And I view that as a challenge, because if I can't explain it, I don't really understand it. So I want to be able to understand it and explain it, and I want it to be true. And so that's kind of like, I guess, a really bad way of explaining that process, but there's something there, I think.
So you come to decisions quickly. Have you found yourself getting into situations that you wish you could take back because of that?
Oh yes, absolutely. I definitely have been in situations where I have, embarrassed myself because of how quickly I come to decisions. And, that's one of those things, like Richard Feynman said, being wrong is an opportunity to learn something new. And so, being kind of this fairly self-confident person as a boss, my employees take great joy in when I'm wrong. They're very excited when I do something wrong or say something wrong, or when I turn out to not be correct. And so my reaction to that just has to be humility. Just has to be, you're right, I'm wrong, I'm sorry. I definitely have been embarrassed by my own. And so, that's one of those things that 10 years ago, I think I've grown quite a bit, is what I'll say, because of, learning these lessons along the way.
So how do you deal with emotionally charged situations?
How do I deal with emotionally charged situations? I am kind of a really analytical guy, and so I can be really detached in those situations. That can be good and bad, though, because I do think that, in a lot of cases, if someone's, if it's at council or in our personal life, emotions are part of being human, and that's a good thing about us, that we care about things and that we invest in those things. That's not a bad thing. I do think that can be problematic when it comes to decision making. I'm, like I said, I'm a very logical, systematic kind of thinker, but I like to recognize that emotions are not a weakness. Emotions are not a sign of irrationality. That's something that I actually was reading this book just recently, and I can't remember the name of it, but he went through talking about the conception of how we as humans have viewed like emotionality and these things, and emotions are critical to how we form opinions. And so I don't want to discount those emotions. And when people do come in, like I said, if it's in front of council, if they come in very, very invested and emotionally attached to an issue, I don't think that is a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. I do think that, we have to be objective when we can. And so I like to lower the temperature and talk about where we can all agree broadly, and then, find that common ground so that we can work backwards. So, if someone's really angry about this one thing, I want to talk to them about the things that we do agree on, and then use that to build a bridge to where we disagree, and find out where the disagreement is, and find out what we can do to, solve it, or change. Someone might have to change their mind, or sometimes you just have to find that compromise where, that's, compromise is kind of both sides losing sometimes, but sometimes that's what needs to happen.
Who or what do you turn to when making difficult decisions?
Who or what do I turn to when making difficult decisions? Well, in my personal life, my mom has always been, a rock in my life, and that's, she's always been there when I need any sort of counsel. In my business, I definitely have a few employees actually that I have a lot of respect for, that they've worked for me for a long time, and so I do like to talk things out. That's like I said, that's part of my process too, is just I want to talk things out so I can test ideas, and I can, I think that's a good, healthy way to do things. I don't like to just sit there and stew on it. I don't think that generally results in me getting anywhere productive. I want to talk to people. And as far as the city council, I think we have a really great team at council, and to me, talking city issues out, Dan McKean he's been just an amazing, he's been an amazing city manager, I think, for Port Angeles, and getting in discussions with him one-on-one. We try to have a meeting before every council meeting, sometime either on the Friday or the Monday before, to talk out some of these issues if I have concerns or whatever. And, the way that he's held me to a pretty high standard, he doesn't put kid gloves on. He, makes me do my job, and it's been a really great learning opportunity. And so, I really have been blessed to have him as the city manager who, he's not gonna just sit there and explain things to me like I'm a kid. He's gonna, he wants me to be asking questions, and he'll have good answers, but, yeah.
What is a life lesson you'll never forget?
What is a life lesson I'll never forget? That's a good one. That's another one that's kind of broad. It's hard to focus it down. I guess one of the kind of public figures that I've always had a lot of respect for was Mr. Rogers. And he gave testimony in the 1970s, I believe, when PBS's funding was threatened, and he gave testimony before the Senate, and he just kind of talked about what he was about and how he did his television shows. And his television shows were really amazing because he actually just talked to children like they were actually humans. And that's something that, our culture didn't always. Children, I'm really passionate about children because I have these kids, and society doesn't always treat children with a lot of respect, and he treated them with immense respect. And he talked about, how one of the things that he talked about in that testimony was about being angry and dealing with those emotions. And I just, listening to him talk about those things as an adult, I was like, man, I could learn a lot about how I deal with my anger, about, and he had a song that he was reciting the lyrics to, and some of those, it's a funny thing, but Mr. Rogers, like a lot of the things that he would say really stick with me. And I've had a lot of respect for him for my adult life, especially once I started having kids and kind of realizing the wisdom that was there the whole time. When I was growing up, I watched him every once in a while. You know, we would come home after school and watch, and I don't think a lot of people realized how important what he was saying was and how impactful it was.
I remember that testimony. I actually saw that, looked it up myself one day.
Yeah.
It was a very powerful testimony that you did give.
It was.
If you could ask one person, dead or alive, one question, what would you ask?
If I could ask one person, dead or alive, a question, what would I ask?
Question.
I mean, there's too many. That's really hard. And you know, people have posed kind of forms of this question before, and it's so hard to narrow it down, just because there's so many that I would want to ask. Yeah. There's a lot of historical figures, and this is kind of part of history that I think a lot of times we view history as these like great people through history, these big towering figures. And it's easy to remember that there's also these just thousands of humans just experiencing life in just really, you know, normal ways where they just want to live and be free and have families and have children and be fulfilled. And so a lot of times I think we get too focused on those big famous people. And so I would want to find, you know, that's why someone like, I've always loved Martin Luther King Jr., but that's why someone like John Lewis, who was kind of like, you know, the step down. He was this really young guy who was, you know, involved in activism in the civil rights movement. He wasn't like the big gung-ho, like charismatic leader that was giving these beautiful speeches. And Martin Luther King Jr., I love his speeches. I love his quotes. He's one of the most quotable guys you can find, doing really great work. And so I would want to find out about some of those lives. You know, people don't realize Rosa Parks was an activist for years before she ever made a decision on a bus to, you know, to have that civil disobedience. And there were countless people working alongside her that history has forgotten. So I would want to find one of those people that history has forgotten and ask them about what was it like to be in this movement? What was it like, you know? Because right now in our national politics, there's a lot of ways that you can see this, you know, these parallels between, we're going through a lot of turmoil in some ways, and are we, I don't know, how are people going to look back on us in 50 or 60 years? Because we look back on the civil rights movement with a lot of admiration, and at the time, I don't think anybody thought, oh, you know, this is the civil rights movement. This was just their lives. This was just what they were doing. And yeah, so that's kind of a non-answer, but I would want to find one of those, you know, those more hidden people that we've forgotten the name of, and just ask them what was it like to be living your life in the middle of this movement that you didn't know was going to be as impactful as it was.
It's actually more clear than you might think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
So, if you're interested in music and you're interested in politics, when did you become interested in politics?
When did I become interested in politics? I think it was, let's see here, the first presidential election I voted in, I think it was in 2000. And I graduated high school, maybe it was 2004, I think it was 2000. I graduated high school in the year 2000. There was the presidential election then, and I voted, but I wasn't really connected to many of the issues. And in 2004 I voted, but I wasn't really connected to many of the issues. And around that time I graduated college. And so I was kind of starting to have these conversations, but I would say it probably wasn't until about 2006 or 7 that I really started, you know, getting into the arguments, the debates. And looking back, I had an internet message board that a lot of my friends were members of, and we would have debates about this or that. And looking back, like, I was probably a train wreck of, you know, contradictions, and a lot of times I was just arguing because I wanted to win. Because like I said, I love these competitive, strategic kind of games and puzzles. And I think a lot of time when I was younger, that's how I viewed politics. It was a way to win. I wanted to show that I was smarter than someone. I wanted to argue them and show that they were wrong. And so kind of that was my transition into like realizing that politics isn't about being right. It isn't about, you know, your side winning or identity. It's about, you know, shaping the policy that affects real people's lives. And so that, you know, I was interested in politics, but I think I was really interested in, you know, that competing and the strategy and the arguing and debating more so when I was younger. And then as I kind of grew up and aged and matured, I really think that it was pretty recently that I kind of had that frame shift into thinking about politics in a different way. So I think that was really recent, actually.
Who are the public figures or politicians you respect and look to for reference or guidance or to model after?
Public figures that I respect and look to for guidance. That's a hard question, because one of the things when you dive deep into politics, like I said, it's with that frame shift that I had, where before I was looking at politics like more of like an identity, more like, you know, my side and my team. And when you get into that, it's really easy to find heroes. It's really easy to be like, oh, this guy. And those are really polarizing figures a lot of the times. And when you move away from that to start thinking about, you know, more the nuance about like, what are real people's lives? How are real people's lives impacted? Because when we're talking about politics, we're talking about, you know, shaping a society of, you know, what infrastructure is the city of Port Angeles going to provide that affects real people's lives, and that affects their business decisions, that affects their personal decisions. And once you start getting into that side of it, then all these public figures, you can see all these ways where, I don't know, you just start to see more flaws in people. And so a lot of the people that I was really attached to when I was younger, I just start seeing more, I don't know, it's funny because I get more optimistic but more jaded at the same time. Because I always loved Barack Obama. I always just was, you know, that hope and change message. I really was motivated by that at some point in my life, where I thought this was the guy who was kind of transcending partisanship. He was saying, no, it's not about left or right. We can all come together. And, you know, I think I agree with him on a decent amount of policies. But like I said, then you age and you just start to see flaws. And so it's hard. It's hard to pick names when they're, in American history, there's definitely a lot of, John Quincy Adams was one of the guys in American history that I really loved, because he was kind of this guy who, you know, he had, you know, his father was president, he became president, he had kind of a failed presidency, but then in his post-presidency, he picked this one issue. He was in the House of Representatives after he was president. So he was president for 4 years, generally regarded as a failure. He didn't accomplish a lot. Then he ran for the House of Representatives, which is like 4 steps down, and just got singularly focused on slavery and made a lot of these little changes. So he's not the guy that, you know, abolished slavery. He's not, you know, he wasn't this one guy where, you know, and you go to other countries, you can talk about William Wilberforce, who was this big driving figure in the abolition of slavery. John Quincy Adams was this like incrementalist. He was like, okay, what can I change in Congress? What can I change where I'm at? And one of his major accomplishments along that path was he got rid of what was called the gag rule, where on the floor of Congress you weren't allowed to mention slavery for a good chunk of American history. You weren't allowed to even say the word. You would get censured by the leadership of Congress. And he abolished that. He was one of the main figures that got rid of it. So, you know, he's not, you know, coming to all the American people and making these huge promises and saying, I'll fix everything because I'm this great guy. He was sitting there behind the scenes making these incremental changes which set the stage for someone like Abraham Lincoln to make this a big national issue and eventually, you know, get it over the finish line. And that's the way I think politics is more like in real life. We're making small changes that work our way towards people's lives being better. And so that's someone that I do really have a lot of affinity for. And like I said, it's frustrating when the more you learn about American history, the more you see how all of our leaders were flawed in some way. And I think there's 2 ways that you can go from there. One way is you can just get despondent and you can just throw up your hands and give up, and then you're just like this jaded person who all you do is want to point out the flaws, because you can talk about how he owned slaves, or he did this, or he had this relationship with his wife, or whatever it was. But I think the other option is to just accept that we're all flawed, and we all have these ego traps that we can fall into. Being the president of the United States is not good for someone who has ego problems, and we've seen that in recent history and in past history. Or like I said, you can just make small changes and remember that we're here to serve, and we want to make people's lives better. And I really believe in that incremental approach to say, what can we do to make people's lives better a little bit? We don't have to promise the world. We just have to move towards a vision, a future that that is achievable.
How about non-public figures?
Non-public figures, meaning
Not political.
non-political figures. Oh, okay. So like public figures that are non-political that I
Correct.
look up to. Well, I've always loved science, and so I have an affinity towards science communicators. So I always liked Neil deGrasse Tyson. He just has this way of communicating science in simple enough ways that you can get it without dumbing it down. And I just love his, optimism and his, he was someone that I always just really liked. And, he was someone who had considerable roadblocks in his path to become a major prominent scientist, and he overcame them. And, he's really, I think he's just a great science communicator. And I think that's something in our society we need desperately, where there's, it's easy to talk about the politics of science because there are ways in which it falls down the political spectrum. But I think the bigger problem that we have is that just everybody could learn a little bit more science and we would all be better off. We could learn a little bit more about chemistry or whatever it is, and everybody would be better off. Because science is a big deal, and not knowing science and not knowing science is a process, and that's what I think really matters, is that science is a way of understanding the world. And it's a way of understanding the world that's based on reason and facts, and evaluating those facts, and being inquisitive about those facts. And when we don't understand that process, then we're open to, mistruths. And so, to me, it's like an inoculation. If you have a good solid grounding in science, it's going to be really hard to trick you. People aren't going to be able to sell you things that are, nonsense garbage products. They're not going to be able to trick you into believing something that's not true, because you're going to have a good solid base of knowledge, and you're going to have a good solid process on how do I figure out whether something's true or not.
When you were a candidate, did you go door to door? And if so, what was it like?
When I was a candidate, so I didn't go door to door in the primary. We had a primary, so we had 3 people running. And I did like a mailer, and I went to a lot of candidate forums, but I didn't actually go knock on any doors, which probably would have been a great idea. I ended up doing fine in the primary. And then I got you go to the auditor's office and you get a list of addresses that are registered to vote, and you can go knock on those doors. And I had gotten that list, and I was planning it out, and I was talking to some friends that were going to maybe help me. My mom wanted to go knock on doors and tell people that her son was running for city council. And so we were talking about, you'll take this neighborhood. And then as that happened, my opponent dropped out of the race. And so I eventually ended up really not knocking on hardly any doors, which, it probably would have been a good idea to do so, even though I was functionally unopposed. But I ended up, going to just a lot of meetings and candidate forums as it was alone. But I ended up not knocking on any doors. And I do kind of regret not going out there and doing it anyway, because I think it would have been a good way to just get to know the community and for them to get to know me.
And for the experience.
And who knows if I might want to run for something again. It would have been a good experience to kind of get that under my feet. So
what was the candidate forum experience like for you? Since you did only have a couple where you actually did have to go up against your other opponents at the time, but then afterwards, when they dropped out, you were still at a couple of the forums.
Yeah, so the candidate forums were great. I really enjoyed them. And, I think that people don't realize like the value of some of the community groups that we have. Kiwanis and Seroptimists and Rotaries, like the fact that they put these candidate forums on so that you can get in front of these, they can see the candidates before elections happen is really valuable. I enjoyed them a lot. And I had a slate of them in the primary, and my experience with them was I felt just wildly unprepared in many ways because you have the filing week and you sign up and you're all excited and you're thinking about all these different ideas, and it almost seemed like there was hardly any time that passed before suddenly people were wanting to put you on a stage and there was a reporter in the audience and they were putting a microphone in your face and asking you questions. So it was really intimidating. But I really enjoyed the process because it was a good opportunity to just get out there in public and, try those ideas out and have that back and forth and think on your feet. And I really loved it. And after the primary, I think it was there was one scheduled, and it was like the day before my opponent ended up dropping out. And so we didn't have any in the primary that were contested, but I still went to a few, and they were honestly even harder when you were uncontested, just because, there was no time to think in between questions. It was just question and question and question, which was a great challenge. It was a lot of fun, but when there was an opponent, when he was talking, I could write myself a note or think like, oh, how am I going to answer that question? When there's no opponent, you're it. So it was a lot of fun, but I enjoyed it a lot. And a lot of times the moderators and people are just really great community, members and leaders that, I got to do a big radio interview with Todd Ortloff. He's a great guy who was asking really relevant questions, and he wasn't trying to get any gotchas or anything like that, but he was asking really good questions about Port Angeles, and he was trying to get to my, what's your vision of Port Angeles? What are you? And some of those were really tough questions to ask, but they're great questions to have public figures answer. And so I really enjoyed that process.
For those who might not know, who were your primary opponents and who was left before the dropout? So
in the primary, it was an interesting situation because what people don't, there was 4 positions open and anybody could sign up for any. There was no geographic restrictions, and so I ended up filing.
You have to be within the city.
Well, you have to be within the city limits, but some cities, have districts where there's the west side of town and the east side of town, whatever, all like that. But yeah, you had to live in the city limits. But I actually, before filing week, sometimes people announce for certain seats, which happened in certain races. I didn't announce for a seat because I still wasn't 100% sure. I actually had on Monday night of filing week, which you had until Friday, but I wanted to do it early. I wanted to get in there. I was still like, am I going to do this? Am I not going to do this? Do I really have time for this? Is this is this going to throw off my work-life balance with my family? So I was still thinking about those questions, but I ended up filing, and I filed for a seat that was held by the only incumbent running, and that incumbent was Lee Whittam. And he was a really nice guy, but I really felt like we needed change and we needed new viewpoints, and I was fairly upset at how some of the public debates had gone, and I didn't think there was enough. One of the principles of debate that I really believe in is the principle of charity, in which you try to give your opponents as much of the benefit of the doubt as you possibly can, and I didn't really feel like that had always happened on city council. So I wanted, I filed for engage the position that he was filing for or not, but so we ended up with 3 people, so it was myself, Lee Whittam, and then Jacob Oppelt. And then the incumbent surprisingly didn't make it through the primary, which was, I think, a big shock for a lot of people.
It was for me as well.
Yeah.
I actually expected him to go at least to the end. So what was it like discussing this potential candidacy at home with the family?
My wife was always very supportive of whether or not I was going to run. She was just concerned about the time.
This concludes this broadcast of Port Angeles News. Until next time.